For the better part of a century, ocean liners were the backbone of international travel. More than 30 million people crossed the Atlantic on them between 1880 and 1914 alone. They carried immigrants, projected national power, and fueled corporate empires. By 1960, jets seized a third of the transatlantic market, and the golden age was finished. But no single event killed this industry. It took 2 world wars, a global depression, and the jet engine to finally break it. And the real question is, what made the system so powerful in the first place? Steam power did more than just shorten a voyage. It changed the very logic of shipbuilding. By the late 19th century, the transition from sail to steam was nearly complete. The screw propeller, first proven on large liners in 1889, replaced the old paddle wheels, delivering greater thrust and smoother, more reliable crossings. Steel, not wood or iron, became the backbone of hull construction. The first all-steel frames appeared in 1892, doubling the strength-to-weight ratio and allowing ships to grow in both size and ambition. Shipyards like Harland and Wolff in Belfast and John Brown on the Clyde adopted these new materials and methods at scale, feeding the demand for ever larger, faster vessels. Steam engines themselves evolved rapidly. Early compound engines gave way to triple expansion models, then to turbines, each step squeezing more miles out of every ton of coal. Efficiency was not just a technical concern, it was the lever that made regular, scheduled service possible. Liners could now promise fixed departure dates, confident that wind and weather would not dictate the timetable. This reliability transformed transatlantic travel from a gamble into a system, opening the way for mass migration, mail contracts, and coordinated logistics on a scale the world had never seen. But these advances came at a human cost. Shipyards became centers of intense, often dangerous labor. Riveters worked in teams. One man heated the red-hot rivets, another caught them in a bucket, and a third drove them home with a heavy pneumatic hammer. Diaries from the Clydeside shipyards describe 12-hour shifts, the constant thunder of metal on metal, and the pride of watching a hull take shape under their hands. A single hull might consume over 1 million rivets, each one set by hand. The work was grueling and relentless, but it gave rise to a new industrial workforce, skilled, organized, and crucial to the age of the ocean liner. The scale and speed of construction now depended as much on the coordination of men as on the machinery itself, setting the stage for the next leap in global transport. Steam-driven reliability did more than transform shipyards. It rewired the very geography of global movement. By the 1890s, the North Atlantic had become a corridor defined by fixed, dependable routes. The fastest regular path, Liverpool to New York, could now be completed in just 6 days by 1899, a journey that once took weeks under sail. These crossings were not random zigzags across an open ocean. Instead, they followed tightly plotted tracks, with ships departing and arriving according to printed schedules. The Atlantic became a grid of invisible highways, each lane assigned to a specific line, each timetable coordinated with railway connections on both continents. Major ports anchored this network. Liverpool, with its deep-water docks and direct rail links, handled westbound emigrants and eastbound goods. New York's piers stretched along the Hudson, designed to funnel passengers and cargo straight onto waiting trains or ferries. Hamburg offered a gateway for Central and Eastern Europe, its Speicherstadt warehouses stacked with baggage and mail. Southampton, Le Havre, and Bremen joined the system as alternate nodes, each optimized for the demands of their national lines. Steam tugs, dredged harbors, and electric lighting allowed round-the-clock operations, shrinking turnaround times and increasing the tempo of transatlantic exchange. The network extended far beyond the ocean itself. Inland railways synchronized their schedules to meet incoming ships, while telegraph cables flashed news of arrivals and departures across continents. Mail contracts required liners to hit precise waypoints, with government inspectors recording every delay or deviation. The result was a supply chain that linked steel mills in Sheffield to warehouses in Brooklyn, and wheat fields in Ukraine to bakeries in Boston. Every crossing became a moving piece in a system of global logistics, one that depended on the absolute predictability of steam. By the turn of the century, the Atlantic was no longer a bridge, its surface mapped by regular, overlapping routes that made the world smaller, faster, and more connected than ever before. Between 1880 and 1914, the Atlantic crossing became a pipeline for human movement on a scale never seen before. In 1907 alone, 1.55 million travelers arrived in the United States by ship, the single highest annual total ever recorded. Most of these passengers were immigrants, packed into the lower decks of liners sailing from ports in Britain, Germany, and beyond. The demand was relentless. Steamships filled their steerage compartments week after week, driven by families fleeing economic hardship, political unrest, or the hope of new opportunity. Ports responded with a new kind of infrastructure. When Ellis Island opened in 1892, it was designed to process thousands of arrivals each day. By the early 1900s, the station could handle up to 5,000 newcomers in a single shift, sorting, inspecting, and routing them onward by rail. Liverpool's Prince's Dock and Hamburg's St. Pauli piers expanded in parallel, adding inspection halls, waiting rooms, and direct rail connections to the interior. This ceaseless flow of passengers justified the construction of ever larger fleets. Shipping lines invested in new tonnage not just for luxury or speed, but to meet the raw numbers pouring through their booking offices. The business of migration became a logistical engine, feeding the growth of cities, ports, and the companies that moved millions across the sea. Government policy turned the Atlantic liner into a national project. Mail contracts, awarded by the British and German states, offered steady cash flow on every crossing, often £15,000 per voyage for ships carrying the Royal Mail. These contracts did more than cover costs. They became the backbone of the business, insulating operators from the swings of passenger demand. But the strings attached were tight. To qualify, ships had to maintain high average speeds, deliver mail on precise timetables, and meet strict reliability standards. The result was a relentless race for technological advantage. Shipping lines poured money into faster engines and sleeker hulls, chasing the blue riband, the unofficial prize for the fastest Atlantic crossing. In 1909, the Mauretania set a new record at 26 knots, a figure that forced rivals back to the drawing board. Each new contract cycle raised the bar, pushing designers to adopt turbines, oil-fired boilers, and ever larger hulls. British and German shipyards became testing grounds for the latest engineering, all in pursuit of state-backed prestige. An expert voice from King's College London sums up the era. The British-German liner duel was less about luxury than about a state-driven quest for naval credibility. The cost of this rivalry was measured not just in steel and coal, but in the escalating budgets that threatened to outpace even the most generous subsidies. The pressure to deliver mail on time, at ever higher speeds, made every voyage a test of national ambition, and set the stage for the sharply divided social worlds that would flourish on board. By the early 1900s, the three-class layout had become standard on nearly every major liner, transforming each ship into a floating city divided by walls, decks, and invisible lines of privilege. First class occupied the uppermost decks, their cabins arranged along wide corridors lined with thick carpets and polished brass. A diary entry from a 1911 crossing describes an evening in the grand dining saloon. Tonight, the orchestra played as we dined beneath crystal chandeliers. The menu featured oysters, roast beef, and French pastries, as fine as any hotel in London. After dinner, we promenaded on deck, the sea calm and endless under the stars. 2 decks below, steerage passengers lived a different reality. A letter from a Hungarian immigrant in 1907 recalls, "We sleep in rows of bunks, 40 to a room. The air is thick, and the children cry at night. Yet there is hope in every heart. Each day brings us closer to America." Communal meals, shared washrooms, and the constant press of bodies defined daily life. A curator from the National Maritime Museum offers context. These ships were microcosms of the societies that built them, luxury and deprivation layered side by side. The system worked as long as the flow of passengers and money continued uninterrupted. But for those in steerage, the journey was often the hardest part of leaving home. The outbreak of World War I in 1914 shattered the rhythm of transatlantic travel almost overnight. Governments moved swiftly, commandeering a significant share of the world's largest liners for military use. The British Admiralty alone requisitioned at least 18 major passenger ships, converting them into troop transports, hospital ships, and armed auxiliaries. German lines saw their flagship vessels interned or seized in foreign ports, while American and French authorities followed suit, stripping commercial schedules of their fastest and most reliable ships. The numbers were stark. By 1915, more than half of the British and German liner tonnage had been removed from civilian service. Some vessels, like the Mauretania and Aquitania, shuttled hundreds of thousands of soldiers across the Atlantic, their grand salons emptied of tourists and filled with rows of cots. Others, such as the Lusitania, met disaster, torpedoed by a German U-boat in May 1915, with nearly 1,200 lives lost. Insurance rates soared, and the risk of crossing the Atlantic, once a matter of weather and machinery, became a question of survival. The war's demands strained the entire system. Regular mail contracts lapsed, migration flows collapsed, and shipping companies faced mounting losses as their prized assets disappeared into military service or the depths of the sea. The commercial fleet that had seemed unstoppable before 1914 now stood depleted and battered, setting the stage for a massive rebuilding effort in the years that followed. After World War I, shipping companies faced a battered fleet and an uncertain future, yet the drive for ever larger ships only intensified. The 1920s brought a new benchmark: ocean liners over 40,000 gross tons, vessels like the Majestic and Ile-de-France. These ships were not just bigger, they were costlier to build, crew, and operate. The logic behind their scale was simple: more passengers per crossing meant more potential revenue. But the reality was more complex. Operating costs soared as hulls grew. Fuel alone accounted for nearly 30% of expenses, with coal and increasingly oil burned in vast quantities to maintain high speeds. Crew wages and provisions made up another 20%, reflecting the sheer manpower needed to run floating hotels that stretched nearly 900 feet from bow to stern. Even with full bookings, profit margins remained thin. The economics of these giants depended on steady streams of passengers, immigrants, tourists, and business travelers filling every available berth. Any drop in demand, whether from immigration quotas or economic downturns, left companies exposed. The pursuit of scale was a gamble, one that locked operators into high fixed costs and made them vulnerable to the first sign of instability. The interwar boom looked impressive on paper, but beneath the surface, the system was fragile, its resilience tested long before the Depression would bring the reckoning. The Wall Street crash of 1929 sent shockwaves through the heart of the ocean liner business. In just 4 years, transatlantic passenger numbers collapsed by nearly 40%. Ships that once sailed at full capacity now left their home ports with entire decks sitting empty. Between 1929 and 1933, the industry's bedrock, steady migration, and growing tourism eroded almost overnight. Companies scrambled to survive. White Star and Cunard, once fierce rivals, began talks that would lead to a forced merger by 1934. Smaller lines disappeared or were absorbed, unable to cover basic costs as bookings vanished. With fewer passengers, sailings were slashed and schedules trimmed. Shipyards halted new construction, and vessels still under contract were sometimes abandoned partway through construction. The financial pressure trickled down to every level. Crews were laid off, wages cut, and maintenance deferred. Even the most famous ships, like the Majestic and Leviathan, spent months laid up, too expensive to operate without full cabins. An economic historian at the London School of Economics described the situation, saying the government's guarantee of a minimum profit for mail carriers turned commercial risk into a public policy instrument. But even these subsidies could not fully shield the industry from the Depression's impact. By 1933, the liner system that had once seemed unbreakable stood on the edge of collapse, its future hanging on the uncertain promise of recovery or the next global crisis. Between 1939 and 1945, the ocean liner fleet suffered losses on a scale that no industry could absorb. At least 18 major liners vanished from commercial service, sunk by enemy torpedoes, destroyed in air raids, or left beyond repair by the end of the war. Names that once symbolized national pride, like the Athenia and the Lancastria, appeared on casualty lists compiled by Lloyd's and the National Maritime Museum. Wartime service accelerated obsolescence as well. Ships built for luxury crossings were stripped of their fittings, painted gray, and pushed far beyond their original design. When peace returned, the surviving vessels faced a new reckoning. In 1947, a wave of scrapping swept through the industry. Shipyards dismantled aging hulls by the dozen, driven by new safety codes and the impossibility of updating coal-fired engines for a changed world. The post-war vacuum left shipping lines with a fraction of their former capacity. Too few ships, too old, and too costly to modernize. The era of the great liner was not simply wounded, it was fundamentally broken, leaving the field wide open for new forms of competition. GT propulsion rewrote the rules of transatlantic travel almost overnight. In 1958, BOAC's de Havilland Comet 4 and Pan Am's Boeing 707 began offering scheduled New York to London flights that completed the journey in just 12 hours, including takeoff and landing. That was less than a quarter of the time required by even the fastest ocean liners, which still took 4 or 5 days to cross the Atlantic. The effect on passenger habits was immediate and measurable. By 1960, airlines had captured roughly 30% of the transatlantic passenger market, a share that had been nearly zero just 15 years earlier. Business travelers and affluent tourists, once the backbone of liner revenue, now opted for speed and convenience over tradition and ritual. Fares dropped as competition intensified, and the liner companies, faced with shrinking bookings, retired their most famous ships or repurposed them for cruising. The Atlantic, once a highway for ships, was now dominated by jets. The ocean liner's era as the primary means of crossing the Atlantic was over, and the industry's survival depended on finding a new identity beyond simple transportation. Transatlantic flight now compresses journeys once measured in weeks into mere hours, transforming global mobility and erasing the old boundaries of ocean and nation. The forces that ended the liner era, including technological disruption, shifting migration, and volatile economies, still unsettle entire industries today. Progress never guarantees permanence. In every new age of transit, the lessons of obsolescence echo, reminding us that dominance is always provisional. What replaces us is rarely what we expect.